In the dark winter of 1941, Britain stood defiant yet weary. Cities lay in ruins, the Blitz had scarred London, and the Royal Air Force, stretched to its limits, carried the burden of striking back. Each night, from the airfields of Lincolnshire, Norfolk, and Yorkshire, the deep rumble of Merlin engines rolled through the fog. These were the men of RAF Bomber Command, setting off into the unknown, their targets hundreds of miles inside occupied Europe. For many, these flights would be their first and last. By late 1941, Britain's only means of taking the war to Germany was through the night bombing campaign. The RAF strategy, area bombing, aimed to cripple German war production by targeting industrial centers like Essen, Hamburg, and Cologne. But technology was still primitive. Crews navigated by dead reckoning, celestial sightings, and crude radio beacons. Radar aids like G and Oboe were still in early development. For a bomber at 15,000 feet, 1 degree of error meant missing a target by miles. Yet the order was clear: press on regardless. Each mission began in silence. Ground crews worked methodically under red lamps, loading bombs into bays and chalking messages onto their casings. For Coventry, for London. Inside the briefing rooms, young pilots, many barely 20, memorized maps of Europe projected under dim light. The route, altitude, and timing had to be perfect to avoid enemy radar and night fighters. They knew that German Kammhuber line defenses, a web of radar and flak zones stretching from France to Denmark, waited for them. A typical crew consisted of 7 men: pilot, navigator, bomb aimer, wireless operator, flight engineer, and 2 gunners. They flew in aircraft like the Handley Page Halifax and the Avro Lancaster, 4-engine giants that could carry up to 14,000 pounds of bombs but offered little protection if hit. Crews called them lucky ships, or flying coffins, depending on the week. Each man's survival depended entirely on teamwork and trust forged over months of missions. One mechanical failure, one navigational error, and they could vanish without trace. In one recorded log from 57 Squadron, RAF East Kirkby, the entry for December 18, 1941, ends abruptly. The crew of Lancaster W4127, call sign AJM, took off for a raid on the port of Wilhelmshaven. Their last transmission, turning at IP, was received at 22:47 hours. They were never heard from again. Post-war German records would later suggest their bomber was hit by flak near Oldenburg, but no wreckage or bodies were ever recovered. Families received only a telegram: missing in action, presumed lost. It became a familiar phrase in wartime Britain. The human toll of these missions was staggering. The average life expectancy of a Bomber Command airman in 1942 was less than 15 sorties. Yet morale remained astonishingly high. "If we don't do it," one pilot wrote in his diary, "who will?" The courage was quiet, uncelebrated. In mess halls, empty seats were quickly filled, and the next night's mission was already on the board. Survival depended on not thinking too far ahead. As the raids intensified, so did German defenses. Searchlights crisscrossed the night sky, creating deadly cones of light that trapped bombers for anti-aircraft gunners. The Luftwaffe's night fighter force, led by aces like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, became increasingly lethal. Using radar-equipped Messerschmitt Bf 110s, they hunted RAF bombers in total darkness. Crews spoke of sudden flashes, tracer fire, and aircraft that seemed to disintegrate midair, one moment formation, the next silence. Historians later debated whether these early missions achieved their strategic aims. Bomb damage assessment was nearly impossible, and losses were often disproportionate to results. Yet each raid carried symbolic weight. Britain was striking back. For every bomber lost, another would take its place the following night. In 1945, researchers found fragments of British aircraft in the marshes of northern Germany: aluminum frames, rusted turrets, a faded RAF roundel barely visible under the mud. Some wrecks were identified decades later through dog tags or serial numbers. Others remain anonymous, their stories untold. Local villagers still recall hearing the low hum of engines in the night, followed by distant explosions that shook the horizon. These missions were not just flights, they were acts of endurance and defiance. Every takeoff was a gamble against impossible odds. Behind the statistics were men, sons, brothers, friends, who vanished into the blackness above Europe, leaving only the fading echo of engines in their wake. As dawn broke over the airfields, the returning bombers would appear one by one, scarred and smoking. Crews gathered by the control tower, counting. One missing, someone would whisper. Then 2. Then 3. The names were written in chalk on a board, soon to be erased and replaced by others. They called it the longest night, not because of darkness, but because of what it demanded of courage and of silence. And as the war escalated, the RAF's missions grew bolder, riskier, and deadlier still. The next would come in February 1942, a desperate attempt to stop the unthinkable, the Channel Dash. February 12, 1942, a bitterly cold morning over the English Channel. Radar stations along the British coast began reporting something unexpected. German warships moving fast directly through the Strait of Dover. The battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, were making a brazen daylight run from Brest, France, back to the safety of German ports. The operation was codenamed Cerberus by the Germans, but the British would remember it as the Channel Dash. To Britain, the move was unthinkable. These ships had been trapped in French harbors for over a year, under constant RAF bombardment. Their escape through the narrowest, most heavily defended part of the channel was both a humiliation and a challenge to British control of their own waters. When word reached RAF Fighter Command and Bomber Command, orders were immediate: intercept at all costs. But the response was chaos. Fog and poor communication delayed the alert. Many squadrons were already engaged elsewhere. By the time the RAF scrambled, the German flotilla was well underway, protected by a dense screen of destroyers, E-boats, minesweepers, and the Luftwaffe's fighter umbrella. Over 250 Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s from JG-2 and JG-26. Against them, the RAF had only fragments of its striking power ready. The first aircraft to reach the enemy were outdated Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers from the Fleet Air Arm's 825 Squadron. Led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, the Swordfish biplanes were relics from another era, slow, fabric-covered, and hopelessly outmatched. Yet Esmond and his men launched from RAF Manston knowing full well they were flying to their deaths. One pilot reportedly said before takeoff, "We'll give them one for the fleet." They flew at mast height into a storm of anti-aircraft fire. All 6 aircraft were shot down before reaching torpedo range. Only 5 of 18 crewmen were pulled from the freezing channel. None of the torpedoes hit their targets. As the Swordfish fell, Bomber Command prepared its second wave. From bases across southern England, Blenheims, Beauforts, and Hamptons scrambled into the overcast skies. Coordination was poor, radio frequencies jammed, visibility near zero. The bombers flew individually, often without fighter escort. Some were diverted by orders that changed midair, others simply disappeared. Among the squadrons that day was No. 42 Squadron, flying Bristol Beauforts out of Thorney Island. Their mission: intercept the German fleet off the Dutch coast. Pilot Officer Frank Garlick's crew never returned. Their last transmission read, "Engaged enemy ships. Hit by flak." Post-war naval logs from Gneisenau noted a single Beaufort making a low-level attack, exploding on impact. For decades, Garlick and his men were listed as missing. Their wreckage was not discovered until 1980, off the coast near Vlissingen, Holland, still sealed, still intact. Their watches stopped at 13:52 hours. By late afternoon, the RAF had launched over 240 aircraft. Only 39 managed to locate the German ships. Heavy cloud, radar confusion, and the sheer speed of the enemy made interception nearly impossible. Of those that attacked, many were driven off or destroyed by German fighters. In total, 42 RAF aircraft were lost. Not one German capital ship was sunk. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau reached Kiel battered but alive, an extraordinary feat of seamanship and planning for the Germans, and a bitter embarrassment for the British. In London, the War Cabinet was stunned. Prime Minister Winston Churchill called it a disgrace to our arms. But behind the official outrage lay something deeper: sorrow. The sacrifice of Esmond's Swordfish crews, and the dozens of bomber squadrons that never made it back, was quickly overshadowed by the operation's failure. For Bomber Command, it was a grim lesson in coordination and communication, one written in blood. Survivors of the Channel Dash raids spoke later of eerie moments during the attack. "It was like flying into a furnace," one Blenheim navigator recalled. Tracer fire everywhere, green, red, yellow. It was daylight, but you could barely see for the smoke. The Channel, once Britain's mode of safety, had turned into a killing ground. When the skies finally cleared that evening, RAF rescue launches combed the freezing waters. They found only debris, torn fuselage panels, oil slicks, and a few life jackets bobbing among the waves. Many crews were never recovered. The sea had swallowed them whole, leaving behind unanswered questions. Did any make it to shore? Were their survivors taken prisoner? Records remain incomplete, and some missions listed that day have no final log entry at all. Decades later, divers exploring the wrecks off Calais discovered twisted remnants of Bristol Beauforts and Blenheims, their serial numbers still faintly visible. One aircraft's nose art, the words "Press On," was remarkably preserved beneath layers of silt. It became a haunting symbol of those who faced impossible odds and went anyway. The Channel Dash was more than a tactical defeat, it was a turning point. The RAF's vulnerability in daylight operations forced a re-evaluation of its strategy. Bomber Command would henceforth return to the cover of night, refining its techniques for navigation, radar evasion, and target marking. But the price for that hard-earned experience was paid in the lives of men who never stood a chance. The next great test would come just a year later, a mission deep into northern Germany. The target, a mysterious installation on the Baltic coast known as Peenemünde. August 17, 1943, the moon hung full over the Baltic Sea as hundreds of RAF bombers climbed through the clouds above England. Their target lay deep in northern Germany, a remote peninsula called Peenemünde, where intelligence had discovered the Reich's most secret project, the development of a revolutionary weapon, the V-2 rocket. Codenamed Operation Hydra, this mission would become one of the most ambitious and tragic operations of the war. 4 months, Allied reconnaissance flights had captured faint glimpses of Peenemünde, unusual concrete structures, strange launch towers, and long rail lines leading into dense forests. The British suspected that German scientists, led by Wernher von Braun, were building a Vergeltungswaffe, or vengeance weapon. These new missiles, if perfected, could strike London from hundreds of miles away. The stakes were immense and time was running out. At RAF Bomber Command headquarters in High Wycombe, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris briefed his crews. "If we can destroy Peenemünde," he declared, "we may prevent a weapon that could change the course of this war." The operation would involve nearly 600 aircraft, Avro Lancasters, Handley Page Halifaxes, and Short Stirlings, all flying low across the North Sea under moonlight. Each crew carried detailed photos and models of the facility. The primary targets were the living quarters of key scientists, the experimental workshops, and the assembly halls. Precision for once was essential. At 21:51 hours, the first bombers lifted off from RAF Scampton and Waddington. The engines roared like thunder across Lincolnshire. Each man knew this mission was different. This was not about morale bombing or industrial targets, it was an attempt to decapitate a secret weapons program. The plan was complex. The first wave would mark the workers' housing, the second would strike the testing grounds, the third, the factories and power stations. Navigator diaries reveal the tension. "Over the sea, moon bright, formation holding," one wrote. "Radio silence. Just the sound of engines. Feels like flying to another world." The journey took nearly 4 hours. Radar operator G signals flickered in and out. Below, the North Sea shimmered in silver light, a perfect backdrop for German night fighters. As the bombers approached the Baltic coast, flak batteries opened up. Peenemünde was lit with defensive searchlights, but the first wave pressed on. Pathfinders from No. 8 Group, equipped with new target marking flares, dropped their markers with near-perfect accuracy. Lancaster ED 989 of 97 Squadron, piloted by squadron leader John Vere Hodges, reported, "TI on target. Heavy flak. Fighters active." Minutes later, the radio fell silent. What followed was devastation. Bombs rained down in 3 separate waves. The living quarters were hit first, killing hundreds of engineers and workers, including several key scientists. Fire spread through the workshops, and secondary explosions tore apart rocket assembly lines. The Peenemünde raid delayed Germany's V-2 program by at least 6 months, perhaps more. But the cost was enormous. Of the 597 aircraft dispatched, 40 never returned. Many were shot down by German night fighters from NJG-3, operating from bases at Schleswig and Rostock. Others vanished without trace over the sea. Crews reported seeing comrades plunge into the water, burning or breaking apart. One survivor from 106 Squadron later said, "You didn't look back. If you did, you saw flames and that was the end of someone's world." Among the lost was Lancaster E-176 of 619 Squadron, last seen trailing smoke near the island of Usedom. Post-war German records mention a crash into the water north of Wolgast, but no wreckage was found until 2002, when divers discovered twisted aluminum remains beneath 60 feet of brackish water. Inside the cockpit lay a rusted sextant and fragments of an RAF navigation map still folded in place. The bodies of the crew were never recovered. As dawn broke, surviving bombers limped back across the North Sea, their fuel nearly exhausted. Many crews were too exhausted to speak. Ground crews waited by the runway, counting as aircraft came home one by one. Some returned riddled with bullet holes, engines barely running. Others landed on blown tires, skidding to a halt. One pilot climbed out of his cockpit and simply sat on the tarmac, staring at the horizon. He had seen 5 of his squadron disappear into the darkness. In the weeks that followed, intelligence confirmed the raid's success. The Germans were forced to relocate their V-2 program to the underground tunnels at Mittelwerk in central Germany. But the true toll of the operation remained hidden. The RAF's own records listed dozens of crews as missing. Families received letters beginning with the same cold phrase, "We regret to inform you." Some would wait years before their loved ones were declared dead. To this day, mystery surrounds several of the aircraft lost that night. Some were believed to have crashed into the Baltic and drifted with the current. Others may lie buried under sandbars or hidden in coastal marshes. Occasionally, fishermen still haul up fragments of twisted metal, remnants of the bombers that never came home. The Peenemünde raid was both a triumph and a tragedy, a mission that changed the war's course, yet left behind unanswered questions and untold sacrifice. In the words of one surviving navigator, "We hit our target, but the cost will never leave me." And while Peenemünde burned, Bomber Command prepared for another massive operation, one that would become the deadliest single night in RAF history, the raid on Nuremberg. March 30, 1944. The night was cold, cloudless, and deceptively calm over England. Along the airfields of Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, more than 700 RAF bombers lined up for takeoff, Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Sterlings gleaming under moonlight. The target, Nuremberg, deep in southern Germany. The mission brief had been delivered with grim clarity: disrupt enemy morale. Strike at the industrial heart of the Reich. But among the crews, there was an unspoken dread. Many veterans called it a bad night for flying. They were right. Within hours, the operation would become the costliest disaster in RAF history. The mission, codenamed Operation Nuremberg, began at 2100 hours. The route had been planned to deceive German radar. Instead of flying the direct path across Belgium, the bomber stream would head east toward Frankfurt before turning south, a maneuver meant to confuse enemy interceptors. But fate, weather, and intelligence failures conspired against them. High cirrus clouds illuminated by a bright full moon made the bombers visible silhouettes in the night sky. The Germans had been forewarned. Their radar operators tracked the stream almost from the moment it crossed the English coast. At RAF bases, crews performed their ritual preparations, lucky charms, letters tucked into flight suits, quiet moments in the crew huts. Sergeant Norman Jackson of 106 Squadron recalled writing in his log, "Feels wrong tonight. The moon's too bright, the air too still." Yet orders were orders. By 2200 hours, the sky over England was filled with hundreds of aircraft droning southeast in steady formation. Each bomber carried around 6 tons of explosives, incendiaries, high-explosive bombs, and flares, enough to flatten entire city blocks. As the stream crossed the Belgian coast, German night fighters pounced. The Kammhuber Line, a series of radar-guided control zones, had long been perfected by this stage of the war. Within minutes, Messerschmitt Bf 110s and Ju 88s of Jagdgeschwader 1 and 2 rose to intercept. They attacked with deadly precision, using airborne radar called Liechtenstein SN2, which allowed them to home in on targets in total darkness. Flashes of tracer fire lit the sky. One by one, bombers erupted into flame, spiraling toward the earth. Gunners fought back, but it was chaos. Hundreds of aircraft scattered, their formation shattered. At 23:17 hours, Lancaster LM 514 of 156 Squadron was seen trailing fire near Trier. A survivor from another crew later described, "She just exploded midair. No shoot, no signal, just gone." In the next hour, the Germans claimed 82 kills. Entire squadrons vanished in silence. Wireless transmissions crackled with panic, tail on fire, navigator hit, bailing out, then nothing. Many aircraft crashed in the forests of Luxembourg and the Rhineland, leaving behind only small impact craters and fragments of metal. Still, the survivors pressed on toward Nuremberg. By the time the lead elements reached the target at 1 o'clock hours, visibility was poor and target markers were misplaced due to high winds. Instead of the city center, many bombs fell on the outskirts and nearby villages. Fires raged, but the industrial damage was minimal. What had begun as a decisive blow to German morale had become, in reality, a catastrophic failure. Back in England, the night was endless. At Bomber Command headquarters, Air Vice Marshal Ralph Cochrane watched the radar screens flicker with returning echoes. One by one they disappeared, some lost over the continent, others ditching in the channel. By dawn, the scale of the disaster was clear. Of the 795 aircraft dispatched, 96 had been shot down and dozens more damaged beyond repair. 545 airmen were dead, and another 157 were captured. It was the single worst night in Bomber Command's history. Crew diaries recovered later revealed the human toll behind the numbers. One, written by Flight Sergeant Alan Penrose of 61 Squadron, ends abruptly mid-sentence. Crossing Rhine. Fighters everywhere. His Lancaster was never found. Another entry from a navigator who survived after bailing out near Bonn, read, "The sky was a wall of fire. I thought the world was ending." He was captured by German civilians and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. After the raid, the British press received a carefully worded statement. Last night, heavy forces of the Royal Air Force attacked Nuremberg. Losses were sustained. The true scale of the tragedy was withheld from the public. Within the squadrons, silence reigned. The next evening, empty bunks and untouched mugs of tea in the mess told the real story. For many airfields, it was the highest loss of life in a single night. Historians later called it, the night the bombers burned. Post-war analysis revealed that the RAF's route had passed directly over a concentration of Luftwaffe night fighter bases, a fatal oversight. The decision to fly under a full moon was equally catastrophic. Even decades later, veterans spoke of the guilt of survival. "We knew the odds," one said. But no one expected that half wouldn't come back. Today, the forests around the Eifel and Moselle valleys still hide remnants of that night, engines buried under soil, shattered propellers tangled in tree roots. German farmers occasionally unearth twisted metal and call local museums. Each find reopens a story frozen in time. The Nuremberg raid became the breaking point. It forced Bomber Command to re-evaluate its night bombing tactics, leading to new radar countermeasures and target marking systems. But for those who flew that night, the changes came too late. In the calm that followed, the surviving crews had no time to mourn. Within months, they would be called upon again not to destroy but to save. Their next mission, flying low and unarmed into Holland, to resupply paratroopers trapped during Operation Market Garden. September 18, 1944. The skies over southern England roared with the sound of engines once again, this time not to destroy but to deliver. Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne assault in history, was underway. Its bold objective, seize key bridges across the Netherlands, open a path into Germany and end the war by Christmas. But for the aircrews of the Royal Air Force and Allied transport squadrons, it would become another chapter of unimaginable courage and devastating loss. The operation combined paratroopers, glider troops, and massive air supply missions. The market element, the airborne assault, relied on the RAF and U.S. Army Air Forces to drop and resupply tens of thousands of men from the 1st British Airborne Division, the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, and the Polish 1st Parachute Brigade. The Garden element, ground forces, would push north from Belgium to link up with them. But as history would prove, the plan was too ambitious, the enemy too strong, and the air too deadly. For the RAF, the operation began at dawn on September 17. Over 1,000 aircraft and gliders took off from airfields across England. Their mission was to drop paratroopers near Arnhem, Nijmegen, and Eindhoven, then return daily with vital supplies, food, ammunition, and medical kits. The drops required precision and courage, slow, low-level flight through intense anti-aircraft fire. It felt like flying through hell, one pilot of No. 190 Squadron recalled. You could see the tracer rounds coming straight at you. On the ground, the British 1st Airborne Division had captured parts of Arnhem but was quickly surrounded. Radio contact with headquarters broke down, and resupply zones were soon overrun by German forces. By the third day, the paratroopers were desperate. Ammunition was almost gone, and the wounded filled cellars and schoolhouses turned into makeshift hospitals. The only hope came from above, the RAF's daily supply runs, flown at dangerously low altitudes to drop canisters by parachute. On September 21, 1944, No. 190 and 271 squadrons of the RAF Transport Command were tasked with a critical supply drop over Oosterbeek, west of Arnhem. Their aircraft, twin-engine Douglas Dakotas C-47 Skitrans, flew in tight formation at treetop height, escorted by a handful of Typhoon and Spitfire fighters. As they approached the drop zone, German flak opened up from all sides. You could hear it hitting the fuselage like hail on a tin roof, one co-pilot remembered. Dakota KG-340, piloted by Flight Lieutenant David Lord of 271 Squadron, was hit almost immediately. Fire tore through his starboard engine, but Lord held steady, making 2 full passes over the drop zone to ensure his supplies landed where the troops needed them. His aircraft, trailing smoke and flames, released the last of its canisters before exploding midair. Of the crew, only 1 man survived, parachuting out just before the crash. David Lord was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery, one of only 2 such awards given to Transport Command in the entire war. Elsewhere, the situation was equally grim. Lancaster and Sterling bombers, hastily converted to carry supply panniers, flew missions at dangerously low levels to drop cargo over Arnhem. Many had no fighter escort. One such aircraft, short Sterling LJ-982 of No. 190 Squadron, disappeared after making its drop run. Villagers later reported seeing it glide, aflame, over the woods near Ede before crashing in a field. The remains of the crew were not recovered until decades later, when Dutch farmers unearthed twisted aluminum and fragments of RAF insignia. The tragedy of Arnhem unfolded both in the air and on the ground. German forces, including SS Panzer divisions, surrounded the airborne troops. Communications were sporadic. Supply drops often landed in enemy-held territory. Pilots faced impossible choices: abort the mission or press on through fire. Most pressed on. "We could see tracer rounds going right through the holds," one crewman later said. "You didn't think, you just flew." In all, more than 300 Allied aircraft were lost during Operation Market Garden, including dozens of RAF transports and bombers. Hundreds of aircrew were killed or captured. Many remain officially listed as missing. The fields and forests of the Netherlands still hold their secrets: shallow craters, rusted engines, and fragments of glass from long-buried cockpits. Local historians and excavation teams continue to uncover the remains, carefully identifying crews and giving them proper burials after nearly 80 years. One haunting discovery came in 2019, when Dutch archaeologists near Oosterbeek found the wreckage of a Sterling bomber, its nose art still visible under layers of mud, homeward bound. Inside were personal effects, a pilot's logbook, a crushed cigarette case, and a rosary, silent witnesses to their final flight. The failure of Market Garden marked the last great airborne gamble of the war. It exposed the limits of air power in the face of coordinated enemy defenses. But for the men who flew those missions, it was never about victory or defeat, it was about duty. "We knew the boys on the ground needed us," said one surviving pilot. "That was enough." As the Allies regrouped in the winter of 1944, the air war entered its final phase. Germany was collapsing, but the cost to Bomber Command and Transport Command had been unimaginable. Thousands of names now filled memorial walls from Lincolnshire to Eindhoven, young men who vanished into the skies, never to return. Yet even as the war drew to its bloody close, the RAF continued to fly, across occupied Europe, over frozen rivers and smoldering cities, many never knowing their missions would be their last. Somewhere over Germany's dark forests and misted hills, hundreds of bombers still lay hidden beneath the soil, waiting to tell the final chapter of their story. By early 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, Berlin trembled under nightly bombardment, and Nazi Germany was collapsing from within. But for the men of RAF Bomber Command, the missions did not stop. Each night, aircraft still thundered skyward from the fields of Lincolnshire and Norfolk, bound for targets in the dying Reich. The air war, though nearly won, continued to exact its terrible toll. Many crews, exhausted, superstitious, and counting their remaining sorties, would not live to see peace. By then, Bomber Command's tactics had changed. The massive raids of earlier years were giving way to precision strikes against rail yards, submarine pens, and oil facilities. Yet danger remained as lethal as ever. German flak was concentrated around key cities, and Luftwaffe night fighters, though dwindling, still stalked the skies. One of the last major missions of the war, the attack on the industrial city of Dresden on February 13, 1945, became one of its most controversial. Over 700 RAF bombers unleashed a firestorm that consumed the city, killing tens of thousands. For many airmen, it was a mission that haunted them for the rest of their lives. But not all of the RAF's final losses came during grand offensives. Some aircraft simply vanished on routine sorties, training runs, or mercy flights to deliver food and medical aid in the war's final weeks. With the front lines moving quickly and records often destroyed in the chaos, entire crews disappeared into the fog of war. One such story belonged to Lancaster PB-304 of No. 97 Squadron, last seen on April 16, 1945, returning from a raid on Regensburg. Its final radio message read only, "Engine trouble. Losing height." No distress beacon was received and no wreckage was ever found. For decades, its fate was a mystery. In 2018, nearly 73 years later, forestry workers near Bayreuth, Germany, uncovered fragments of twisted metal in a dense pine forest. The serial plate matched PB-304. Excavators recovered the remains of 4 airmen, still at their stations. Their dog tags were intact, British, Canadian, and Australian. They had likely crashed while attempting to turn back to base, their aircraft consumed by trees and buried by time. Their discovery finally closed a file marked "Missing in Action, Presumed Dead," a phrase that had tormented families since 1945. Stories like theirs are scattered across Europe. In Denmark, the Netherlands, and northern France, the wrecks of RAF bombers continue to emerge from farmland and marsh. Farmers plowing new fields or construction crews laying foundations still stumble upon fragments of perspex, bomb bay doors, or the distinctive 4-bladed propellers of a Lancaster. Each find sets off a chain of investigation, serial number research, archival cross-checking, and sometimes, the return of a lost name to the memorial wall at Runnymede, the place dedicated to those with no known grave. For the families, these discoveries are more than archaeology, they are closure. In 2019, at the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery in Bergen-op-Zoom, the remains of 5 RAF crewmen from a downed Halifax were finally laid to rest, their caskets draped in Union Jacks. A surviving nephew, now in his 80s, whispered through tears, "They've come home." The service ended with the sound of engines overhead, a restored Lancaster from the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight performing a slow, solitary flypast. The human cost of Bomber Command's campaign remains staggering. Out of 125,000 aircrew who served, more than 55,000 were killed, a higher death rate than even among frontline infantry. Most were under 25. They came from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and across the Commonwealth, united by duty and a sense of purpose few generations have known since. Their courage was not born of glory but of grim necessity. They flew because someone had to. In declassified post-war reports, RAF intelligence officers documented more than 1,000 missions listed as unresolved. Some aircraft were seen falling in flames, others simply never returned from the night sky. Even today in remote parts of Europe, the faint echoes of those missions linger in local folklore, in unexploded ordnance found near rivers, and in the quiet reverence of villagers who still tend to small memorials built from salvaged aluminum. Yet for all the records, statistics, and memorials, something about those losses defies explanation. The sheer number of crews who disappeared without a trace suggests that many stories remain hidden, waiting to be told. Not every flight path was recorded, not every crash site marked. Some rest beneath lakes, others beneath the soil of modern roads. Time has covered their traces but not erased them. In the final months of the war, as victory seemed certain, one RAF pilot wrote in his diary, "We are so close now. But it's strange, every mission feels heavier. The lads talk of peace but we fly as though it's still 1940. Maybe we just don't know how to stop." He was lost 2 days later over Bremen. His name is carved into the stone at Runnymede among 20,000 others who never came home. Today, the legacy of those who vanished in the skies endures not in monuments alone, but in the silence they left behind. The roar of engines that once filled Britain's night skies has faded into memory. But across Europe, under forests, rivers, and meadows, their story remains, a scattered archive of courage and sacrifice. These were the men who flew into darkness, knowing they might never return. Their missions, from the Channel Dash to Piemont, from Nuremberg to Arnhem, form a haunting ledger of bravery written in the clouds above wartime Europe. And though their aircraft have long since rusted away, the mystery of their disappearance ensures their memory will never fade, for the RAF's most tragic missions did not simply end in loss. They became part of the sky itself.